there's always this connection, or at least an emphasis on a great restaurant or a great brewery or something, similar like food and beverage.
Yeah.
And I see this across the country in different asset types, but I'm curious what you think the connection is to F&B, to a neighborhood, or to a sense of place.
I think those types of spaces, restaurants, breweries, coffee shops, they're like the last sacred ground of sort of the antithesis of social media. So you really can't get that experience anywhere else from our perspective, and people need that, connection. It feels like now more than ever.
On this episode, I'm speaking with Howard Pastor and Mike Sturdivant of Pastor Properties, now a third-generation real estate company based in the Twin Cities. Howard joined Pastor in 2000 and worked alongside his father, Edward, until his passing in 2012. Today, Howard continues Pastor's legacy of combining local knowledge, regional insight, local relationships, and a broader national perspective. As VP of Development, Mike focuses on sourcing and completing development, redevelopment, leasing, and acquisition projects for Pastor. He's been instrumental in forming new joint venture partnerships and expansion into multifamily development, and played a key role in Pastor's Texa Tonka projects. This is a really fun conversation with a few friends, and I'm excited to hear the story of Pastor, which extends all the way back to before World War II. Let's jump right in.
Great, Howard and Mike, thanks for joining me on Transforming Cities. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here.
You bet. Thanks for having us. Excited.
I love a good three-person conversation here. We don't do it too often on Transforming Cities, so it's going to be fun to hear from both of you guys about the backstory of Pastor Properties and what you're up to today. But if you've listened to Transforming Cities before, then you know that I like to start with backstory. I think it's important for context. And so let's kind of do Howard first, Mike second. Howard, tell me a little bit about where you grew up, what the upbringing was like, and Howard as a youngster. Can you paint us that picture?
I can paint you that picture, yes. Well, I mean, I'm 54 years old, for a little bit longer. So I did grow up in the 70s, which was a fantastic period in America, growing up in the Midwest.
I heard it's only the second fantastic to the 80s, so that's good to know.
I did grow up in the 80s.
Good music
too.
in the 70s.
My music is more influenced by the 80s. But, I would say I grew up in a pretty typical suburban Midwest home, coming from a Jewish family in the upper Midwest. Played sports growing up. I have a little sister. I guess she's still little, but she's now grown up. But growing up, two of us. A lot of humor in my household. I would say that the family business kind of pervaded really every aspect of our life. And my dad was this typical like entrepreneur that probably could never turn it off. People probably define that as a workaholic, but it was just ever present kind of in the conversation at home and at the dinner table and on vacation. And we would, either be out looking at buildings on vacation, my dad and I, or we would be meeting various, business associates of his, either at the dinner table or on vacation, meeting people in some sort of like social settings. So, and I would say, my quality time with my dad growing up would be more, fitting into his schedule, right? It was very different than the way the world works today, where we conform everything to the kid's schedule. Like we conform to his schedule, right? So if I wanted to spend time with him, it would be like going to do errands with him, or, driving around shopping centers on vacation and going through the alleys of shopping centers on vacation in Florida.
Yeah,
good memories like that.
A little bit different these days. I think we were joking when we talked last that, it'd be like having all of our business associates over for dinner nowadays. It feels sort of weird a little bit, but I think maybe more common practice in the 70s and 80s as
for
compared
sure.
to the 2020s.
It was fun.
Mike, Mike, tell me about your background. Are you were you also driving around to to alleyways and loading docks of shopping centers growing up?
Yeah, not so much so ingrained in the real estate like Howard as a youngster. Howard threw out his age, so I'll throw out mine. 36, grew up in the Midwest, had a great upbringing. Really fortunate to have two great parents and four siblings, so kind of a larger family. Like I said, one of five kids. We have a large extended family that's really close. And so, really big get togethers, times at the cabin, uh, hockey and lacrosse. My dad ran a small dry cleaner, so there was always an element of kind of hard work instilled at me at a young age. I remember, as early as I can remember, being at the dry cleaner, helping to just sweep floors, do whatever I could to kind of be helpful. Um, many mornings watching my dad up and out the door, 5:30 in the morning and not back until 6 o'clock. And mom was stay at home. So, she had probably the biggest job in the household.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, really, really fortunate upbringing.
I know we're going to get a little bit more into this, but how did real estate, whereas real estate was really ingrained in Howard's upbringing, how did real estate find its way into your life? Was there anything in particular?
Yeah, yeah. So I had, some exposure to real estate. One of my kind of mentors in the business is my uncle Tim, and Tim is kind of a rock star developer in the Twin Cities and runs today a large development firm. And so uh, he kind of turned my ear to real estate in about 2011. At the time, I was in school. In management in the restaurant business, and he suggested, that I consider getting my real estate license, and that was kind of um, kind of the spark in interest in real estate, and then just kind of went from there.
Mm. Really interesting. I want to, we're going to definitely come back to more of that. I want to dive into right away this story of Pastor Properties. It's a third generation real estate company. And I think the origin story and sort of the over the years story is really fascinating. It's not something that you can scribble in the back of a paper napkin and have the whole story. So I wanted to make sure we had enough time to dive into that today because I think it's, like I said, it's really interesting, but there's so many phases, if you will, to it. It didn't start with what you're doing today with the team at Pastor. And so, Howard, maybe you could kind of walk us through the different iterations because it started um, just after World War II. And so we're taking a trip down memory lane, but maybe you could set the scene for us and kind of walk us through those different time periods.
Yeah, so I would say actually the entrepreneurial part of the business started before World War II. My grandfather was a first generation immigrant, kind of from outside of Odessa uh, in um, uh, off the Black Sea and kind of Russia, Ukraine area. And he immigrated in 1920 with his mother and his four or five siblings.
Mm.
His dad and some of his siblings actually had come earlier and World War One broke out, so they were stuck as as the war broke out. Anyway, he was a very entrepreneurial guy, probably from a young age. Spoke a lot of different languages as a result of kind of being in that part of the world. And I think that he always had this kind of moxie and um, personality. He was a salesperson at heart, and uh, prior to kind of the real estate business, he was in the coin machine distribution business, which means that they, in the call it 30s and 40s, would be the representative for companies like Bally, slot machines, pinball machines, and Wurlitzer jukeboxes, and they essentially had these routes that they owned,
Mm.
and they were the sole like distributor. They would go and basically sell these machines to bars and restaurants, and then they would buy it from Bally, and lease it to these bars and restaurants. And so they kind of started with this distribution business. Then they built a finance business around that, where they were kind of buying and financing the machines. And it was during that business that he met my great uncle, or great great uncle, really his wife, my grandmother's uncle. Um, and they ended up kind of going into business in this coin machine distribution business. It was first called Mayflower Distribution, and then eventually my grandfather bought him out after World War II and kind of renamed it Pastor Distribution. What ended up happening is that I think it was either right before World War II or after it, my Uncle Sam basically took that business with Bally and Wurlitzer and moved to Miami and started kind of developing the business there. My grandfather kind of stayed here. And at the end of World War II, they started developing single family homes in St. Paul in the Highland Park neighborhood with some other relatives. And they were basically building these neighborhoods in St. Paul, these kind of starter homes for all these GIs that were moving back. And eventually that turned into a commercial real estate business where they realized that these neighborhoods didn't really kind of have the goods and services that that would be required. And I think retail was probably changing quite a bit
Yeah.
post World War II, and so they started developing these shopping centers. And they were really involved in some of the first grocery anchored shopping centers here in the Twin Cities. And they ended up having a relationship with one of the grocery stores, grocery chains in town that was owned by a Jewish family with a lot of brothers. And my grandfather was really close with them. In fact, at one point, their office was literally in the same building as ours on University Avenue in St. Paul. And so that really spawned the what was called Pastor Enterprises at the time, and the focus on kind of these neighborhood grocery anchored shopping centers.
That's really fascinating because the way the story is going to trend now, moving forward, in some of the work that you're involved in today and have been involved with over the last decade or so, um, originated in the 40s and 50s. That's really fascinating that this family business seized an opportunity and then kind of realized we need more community with grocery anchored shopping centers and so forth, and all that came from pinball machines and so forth. Which is just I smile at that because it's such a unique story. You don't hear that every day. So, but not to interrupt.
You go with where the sale when you're a
Yeah,
salesperson at
Right.
heart, right?
right. You
You go
find a
and you
sale.
look where is that gap?
Yeah.
Yeah, find.
What needs not being solved in the world, and how can I be a part of that?
So there were a couple more phases really before you stepped in, or maybe one other, I guess, large phase into the 60s and 70s. But I think your grandfather passed away in the early 60s.
Yeah,
What was taking place then?
as this business was kind of growing, and my grandfather was this successful entrepreneur, and um, kind of developing stuff at the forefront of the development of the suburbs. He ended up passing away in the early 60s, and my dad was in college. I think my dad and his older brother were in college, and there were some uncles in the business, and they basically came into the family business, and they did not do a great job with kind of like contingency planning or estate planning, and they were in a really tough spot where they were, you know, moving things around, trying to avoid bankruptcy, and kind of working with the banks and other creditors um, and the government on the estate taxes, and kind of bootstrapped it, and
Mm.
went through probably a lot of trauma just to kind of keep the thing afloat, which they did. Um, and and then my dad and my uncle were really, that was the second generation. They were in the business, and they kind of maintained what they had. They started to do probably a little bit of development, a little bit of acquisition, um, but I would say that that experience for sure colored their risk tolerance, and they were not as they were a lot more risk averse than my grandfather
Mm.
was. Right, my grandfather kind of coming from nothing, probably no big deal for him to risk everything on each deal. Second generation, not so much. Um, anyway, that that's kind of the story for a couple of decades, and then I moved back in March of 2000 to work with my dad. At that point, he had bought his older brother out of the business, and it was just my dad that was in the business. And uh, I was living in Chicago. I had been working with a company called Mid America Real Estate. They were involved in third party leasing, management, brokerage in the Chicagoland area. At the time, that was their only office. Now they have several offices around the Midwest. And uh, great experience for me. I was there for about 8 years. And I realized kind of early on that it would be really challenging to go and work in the family business right away
Mm.
and work with my father, who had this larger than life personality. Uh, and it would not have been healthy for me, our relationship, maybe not healthy for him, but I uh, knew that I would have just gotten like squashed. So I had to kind of run away a little bit and
So you
develop
you
my own
you
skill
two didn't
set.
have you two didn't have the same larger than life personalities, is what you're saying here.
I mean, I don't think that I do. Maybe some people now think that I do. I mean, we're all fighting genetics every
Right.
day, right? We realize
Exactly.
that
Exactly. Yeah.
as we get older. But at the time, he was just this huge, magnanimous personality, and when he walked into a room, like people knew. And uh, when you're the son of someone like that, it's like, okay, I gotta.
Yeah.
I'm just always going to be, you know, Eddie's son. I gotta go and figure some stuff out on my own. So um, I went to Chicago and ended up landing a job with Mid America, and I worked in property management for a couple of years, which was kind of a great building block to kind of understand the shopping center business. Eventually, I moved into more of a leasing role where I was leasing properties for either banks, insurance companies, some individual developers, pension funds, um, all I would say mainly more institutional type owners, but some entrepreneurial owners, and kind of learned the process of both the management and leasing side of the business, and also somewhat right the reporting mechanism and how to track the important metrics, stuff that probably a entrepreneurial jack of all trades real estate company discipline that they uh, typically don't have.
Mm.
um, and after a number of years, I guess my dad convinced me to come back and work with him. And uh, that happened in 2000. And I think the thought was is that I was going to come back and really help stabilize the existing portfolio in some way, shape, or form, and really start to focus in on development and kind of um, growing the company. Um, and I think over the years, because we were not that like a super active developer, um, uh, a lot of our assets were, probably prime for some sort of redevelopment or retenanting type strategy.
Mm.
And some of them maybe just had passed their useful life as the population, kind of grew from, the 60s where there was one suburb to the 80s when there was 3 or 4 suburbs, and better locations and more regional locations had kind of been developed, and probably to the detriment of a lot of the assets that we owned at the time.
Let's let's pause there because I want to ask you, Mike. This is around the time when you ended up crossing paths with Howard in the pastor organization. Um, how about you catch us up to speed with your backstory in terms of cutting your teeth and what you were working on as you ended up ultimately joining the pastor team?
Yeah, yeah. So I joined up with Howard probably 2 years into my commercial real estate career. So I was fortunate enough in 2008 to land a full-time internship with a developer in town that had a really heavy retail, grocery anchored background in the Twin Cities, um, and started in a leasing role and in a really tough market. So we were still coming out of the GFC. Retail had been very overbuilt, and so it would probably take 50 to 100 cold calls to get a showing at that time. And so really kind of learned the business from that market, and then went to another larger developer in town, like I said before, linking up with Howard. And so, yeah, when I got to pastor, meeting with Howard, could just tell that Howard wanted to kind of take the company into the next generation. And so I was fortunate to come in at kind of the foothills of that transition. And so it's been a fun ride.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Transforming Cities, brought to you by Authentic, delivering premier multifamily brand experiences and smart digital marketing. Authentic's proven approach accelerates leasing velocity, boosts rental rates, and increases long-term value. You can find out more at AuthenticFF.com. And by Charles Gate, the multifamily investor's secret weapon to help underwrite, go to market, and operate projects that generate market-beating returns. With an adaptive staffing model and on-demand leasing teams, Charles Gate empowers a better resident experience at an efficient cost structure for today's owners. Visit charlesgate.com for more.
And let's talk about that transition. So we've heard the story now of where Pastor came from, the origin story, more or less. And I'm curious if it's in terms of Pastor today, is it difficult to position the company as something new or transition it into something else when it was, rooted in potentially very different things over the decades, right? It didn't start with where you are today. Is that a difficult challenge to shift? And maybe Howard, you could start us off on this one. Is that a difficult challenge for you? Was that a tricky piece of terrain for you to navigate, or what was that like for you in the call it 2010s?
Well, so I would say I joined the company in 2000. My dad was still around. My dad was active, and he started to kind of become less active. My dad at the end ended up having Parkinson's. Whether it was technically diagnosed or not, I guess kind of irrelevant. But he just became less active in the business, and at a certain point it just was clear that he didn't have the same energy and attention to detail he did previously, as Parkinson's does to people. And so I think oftentimes, like in family businesses, entrepreneurial family businesses, there's not like this formal transition with, you know, confetti and a trumpet and all that kind of stuff. You just end up starting to do more and more stuff that you weren't doing. That's really kind of what happened for me when I kind of came in.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always trying to push. I was trying to push to improve the team, bring on more talent. From my dad's perspective, it was trying to spend more money. He would say, "Look, anyone can spend money. Show me how you're going to make money."
Right.
So I say that anecdote to kind of more kind of communicate this challenge, this typical challenge between family members, particularly a father and a son, second generation, third generation, where there's this, right, this push pull where the younger generation probably wants to take more risks. The second generation is kind of risk averse, and it becomes a battle. And we got things done, not as fast as I would have liked, and then we did start to do some new, interesting, challenging things. My dad passed away in 2012, and I would say a lot of our transition into, call it, mixed use type properties, and certainly going into multifamily ground up development, those happened after my dad's passing. Um, and I would say just natural in a family business where that that freedom that sometimes happens for a leader when the previous generation doesn't have as much right control. Clearly, when one passes, that happens. But I think we have stuck with our ethos of really neighborhood retail, and using retail as that kind of secret sauce or differentiation in the market. Um, and certainly, right, stuck with the principles and the values that were handed down from my father on, right, being prudent and uh, fiscally disciplined, and those types of things, and right, the importance of relationships. Right, we've never really gotten away from those,
Mm.
but it definitely was a change, and I think that the market um, certainly viewed us maybe as less active. I don't know, maybe sleepy. Uh, and for us to kind of transform and be like, okay, we're going to be a lot more transactional. We're going to start to do some development. We're going to start to do some different things, um, and start to get into product types that we were not involved in before. That for sure was different, and it took some transition, and we had to make sure that we were being prudent, and yet uh, also not having it stop us from trying new things.
Mm. Yeah, because what we're talking about right now really is the change in, call it shopping styles or patterns of most of us. We're not going out to the shopping centers every weekend, to the mall and so forth to buy our wares. We're relying a lot more on the internet and Amazon and so forth. And so, this seems like a time period for Pastor where you were having to reevaluate this idea of the shopping center and what this tenant mix was looking like in these shopping centers. And so, um, let's talk about that transition from how do you how do you sort of evaluate that and then transition into this phase where you're thinking of new development and you're thinking of what is a successful tenant mix? Because I think, Mike, you were certainly brought in and had a big hand in starting to transition Pastor and helping Howard and the team do that. um, however you want to unpack that, I'm just kind of curious how that transition took place, and then kind of thinking more of the projects you're working on today, how you're going about those.
Well, I'll set the stage and I'll let Mike kind of
Yeah.
take it from there. But I think what happened is is we owned a lot of these, called suburban assets, and that were B-ish type locations, and particularly the ones where like our Crystal Shopping Center. We had this 200,000 square foot center with a bunch of junior box anchors, and you know call it 5 to 10,000 square foot regional or national type tenants, fair amount of apparel. Uh, and as you started to kind of take a look at like the different tenants that existed and the categories that they represented, um, particularly kind of in that junior box category, you realize that there was less and less of those retailers. And
Mm,
where there used to be, right, call it 3 to 4, there was now only one. And so as we looked at that holistically, we were like, okay, it's going to be really tough for us to play in that environment. What we need to do is kind of take those assets, try and fix them up as best as we can, and sell them and invest in better locations, right? Let's invest kind of up the curve. And I think for us that meant we were going to be investing in more dense urban neighborhoods, first ring suburban neighborhoods where there was good density. Ended up meaning that we were investing in smaller assets, but better quality, better locations, with the thought process that, like, we don't know where retail is necessarily going. Like, we're not smart enough to prognosticate 5, 10 years out what retail is going to look like.
Mm.
We have enough experience to know what good locations are. And as the world changes, we always know that that's going to be, right, a good location with good foot traffic, with good vehicular traffic, with other good kind of co-tenants around. Um, and if it means that we're buying an asset with retail on the first floor and some office on the second floor, how do we learn about this small office and kind of get comfortable with it? Um, Ultimately, I think that that's kind of how we got into this foray with the multifamily, which was the first project that we did with multifamily was our 1700 project across from Ridgedale in Minnetonka, and uh, bought this asset because we thought it was good real estate. It was the Highland Bank building. It was
Mm.
Highland Bank on the first floor and 2 floors of like Class B, C offices. Um, Ultimately, we knew it was a great retail location, but it needed to be more than just retail for us to kind of justify the expense of, right, tearing that building down and doing something different. And it was through that kind of learning and investigation with our friends at Bader Development that we started to learn and understand that it was a really good residential location, and that kind of kicked off us looking at a mixed use project there, which we ultimately got done. Um, we liked that. We kind of liked that development, and I would say that, Mike had recently kind of joined us, and he was eager to kind of get involved in the development side, and he really kind of took that experience and started to really grow the types of opportunities that we were looking at that were more than just retail.
Yeah, Mike, I'm curious from a tenant mix perspective. We've talked a lot about this offline, not on our podcast here, but what are you thinking about? What are you looking for? What opportunities are um, sort of relevant to the work that you're doing today? And feel free to reference a specific project if you want, or experiences that you've had in the past. But I think for those listening who are in this work, or in this field, doing this work, I think hearing from another in the industry is always insightful. So I'm curious what your take is.
Sure. Um, well, for us and probably any real estate project, local expertise really important. We pride ourselves on being local, staying local, and really trying to understand in each neighborhood what is the customer missing, whether that's a uh, commercial retail opportunity void that we think can be filled in some way, shape, or form, or a multifamily opportunity kind of in and around the retail. So, like if we think about our St. Louis Park project, our Texa Tonka projects, it really started with, does the existing center match up with the surrounding neighborhood? And I think as we studied that, the answer was no, it didn't match up. The neighborhood had changed. And so, and from a tenant mix perspective, like I said, you're trying to get smart on what does the customer need and try and match that with, the retailer or operator going into this space. So
Mm.
that's kind of where we like to start. And then the tenant mix, starts to form from there.
You always mention that the main thing that you're focusing on is bringing value to the locals in the neighborhood. And what I've observed is that there's always this connection, or at least an emphasis on a great restaurant or a great brewery or something, similar like food and beverage.
Yeah.
And I see this across the country in different asset types, but I'm curious what you think the connection is to F&B, to a neighborhood, or to a sense of place. How would you think about that, or how does that tie into your work?
And I think Howard hit on it a little bit earlier. Some of that's just been, a natural attrition in the number of retail categories that we're interested we'll call it neighborhood retail. Um, and certainly over, my career have just seen that rent roll shift more and more as a percentage of total kind of food and beverage users. I think those types of spaces, restaurants, breweries, coffee shops, they're like the last sacred ground of sort of the antithesis of social media. So
Mm,
you really can't get that experience anywhere else from our perspective. And people need that, connection. It feels like now more than ever. And so, um, like I said, some of that's been natural evolution of retail. Um, some of that's been intentful on our side, trying to get a tenant mix right. But I think at the end of the day, it does go back towards, what is the resident wanting in their neighborhood and trying to match up
yeah.
with that.
Both of you have talked about being, as humans, we're social creatures. Whether or not we choose to be social is a probably a separate discussion. But this idea that we're drawing energy and inspiration from others is, I think, spot on, and it seems to tie in really well with the work that you're doing today and the opportunities that you're looking at today. And I know from my own experiences with your team and just from reading it in some of your materials, that sense of community and health and purpose and sort of this anti-isolation theme is really important for you all and the work that you're doing. How do you approach this? Kind of a big question here, but how do you approach that, as at the end of the day, call yourselves retail developers, but it's so much more than that. And I'm curious how that is now playing into decisions you're making yesterday, today, and moving forward.
I would say we're neighborhood developers,
Yeah.
really. It's not retail. We started out as retail, but I think as we've evolved, it's this commitment to the neighborhood. Neighborhoods, quite honestly, that either are existing assets where we're relooking at those and trying to figure out, like, okay, does that still work? How do we maybe redevelop this in a way that is more relevant today with where the world is and kind of what these what these neighborhoods want. And so, we've been a part of the neighborhood for several decades, right? For a number of our assets, and I think for some of our newer assets, we actually are we actually live in those neighborhoods, right? So while we might not have owned those assets for more than a handful of years, we actually live, breathe and interact in those neighborhoods all the time. So I think it's that hyper local perspective that Mike mentioned, where um, if you're looking at it from that perspective and looking at it from a perspective that it's something that um, you're going to own and be a part of for the long term, it really does change your perspective. Um, and I think you mentioned it, Chris. I mean, I think what we've kind of figured out is, okay, the existential question of, like, how do you make the world a better place? Um, I mean, ironically, in some small way, as right, a neighborhood shopping center multifamily developer, if we can create awesome, projects, particularly that have some sort of public or communal space where there's a reason for people to get out of their apartments, to get out of their homes, to get off the couch and be around other people, that's like that's amazing for, right, everyone's mental health and sense of belonging. Um, I think you're right. Getting them to actually then interact and meet their neighbors and engage. That's maybe a separate
Right.
discussion. I think uh, for now, right, the thought is, how do we create some of these, right, better, interesting spaces and places, and if we can, right, tie it into nature,
Mm,
tie it into like great landscaping and greenery in a natural environment. Are there walking or biking paths that somehow we can, connect into and leverage some of these community assets that already exist? That's kind of where I think our focus is shifted. Um, And sometimes when you do that, you create maybe something that's a little bit different. And ultimately, that means that we can maybe convince, great coffee shop or restaurateur or, funky retailer or, other fitness type, unique user to kind of go into our projects. And we think that that ends up making the neighborhood better.
Well, as we begin to wrap up, that dovetails really nicely into where I'd like to end the discussion today, and it has to do with the challenges that lie ahead. You sort of started to touch on this, Howard, with regards to programming and how do you activate these spaces and actually get the people there and sort of enjoying that community and or I guess I should say participating in that community. Mike, let's start with you, and then Howard will kind of wrap up. Um, for you, Mike, as you're looking at existing projects, properties, and anything moving forward, what's on your mind as the sort of challenge or the thing that you need to solve in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it back to each project and how unique, every project's so different. And so, yes, there's elements of things that we know have worked well in one vein, and we do try and bring those and infuse them into future projects. But really, you have to get pretty micro on each project, and I think that's both a good thing and a challenge. It's not commoditized, and so you got to really figure out, well, why would this redevelopment work here, and trying to get really smart about testing that thesis and making
Mm.
sure that you're tying into the uniqueness of that area and that project. So
Yeah, Howard, what about you? What's on your mind?
I mean, I think Mike hit the nail on the head. And right, ultimately, that means that if you understand all those nuances and what makes that particular location work for that particular neighborhood, you're going to find the right group, whether it's a restaurant, coffee shop, bar and grill, you know, interesting, right, fitness user. You're going to find that right tenant that's going to fit for that neighborhood. And our job, our job is to be able to create the environment where that tenant can succeed and do the maximum right amount of business right that they
Mm.
can. That's good for the entire right ecosystem, and that means that it's what those neighbors want, and it's right creating more of that stream of traffic and flow right of pedestrians. Um, and it enlivens areas, right? And if you can enliven these areas and make them more active, we do really believe that that makes neighborhoods healthier. And right, it's almost cyclical, right? I mean,
Exactly.
actually, it is
yeah,
very cyclical, right?
yeah,
Everything that we're doing is like the sense of community, right? This downtown area that every city used to have. We're trying to kind of rediscover that because that is what makes communities right healthy, and it makes people feel like um, you know they're included and that they mean something and that their particular neighborhood is right unique. And we're always trying to kind of take that take that approach. And I mean, I think even some of the things that we're talking about right now at more of the traditional neighborhood suburban shopping centers, it's like, okay, how do you bring in these different events? How do you program these events? If I go back 30, 40 years ago, right, we used to have these, kids, cops, firefighters, kind of like low level entertainment type events to try and right bring people in. And as cheesy as that sounded at the time, in some way, shape, or form, we're trying to like
yeah,
recreate that because whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's going to figure it out. If the people are there connecting with each other, that's I think
Yeah.
where the magic is, and that's what we're yearning
Yeah,
for.
yeah, I think that's spot on. I think the term cyclical is uh, very appropriate for the discussion because it's as if, as a society, we've moved to the suburbs, to single family homes that have a big footprint, and then there came a loneliness epidemic. Now it's like, wait a second, what have we done? Oh my gosh! And then there's groups like yours that are thinking about how do we actually start to bring people back together and give the option and the opportunity to connect with local community and neighbors and get the kids back together. And I think that's very appropriate. Cyclical is hits the nail on the head. I want to wrap up with a rapid fire question that I always think is fun just to get inside the head of Howard and Mike in this case. And it always comes back to the book. And it could be a book that you're reading right now that you've just recently wrapped up, or maybe like an all time fave. But Howard, let's start with you. One book that you would recommend and why to the listeners.
I'm reading a book right now called San Francisco by Michael Schellenberger, I think. And it's actually a deep dive into the homeless crisis that we have throughout the nation. And he kind of dives into why we are experiencing that more so today than we have over the last several decades. Pretty eye-opening, and ultimately some really interesting, like creative solutions on how we can solve kind of that mental
Mm.
health and addiction crisis that really is fueling a lot of this homelessness, and not necessarily totally related to what we do, but certainly something that is an epidemic and really important for every community across the country. And so I would
Okay,
recommend it.
noted. Mike, how about you?
Yeah, well, first of all, would love to do more reading than I'm actually doing today. I'll chalk that up to my two young children that keep my wife and I on our toes at reading time. But it's a book called Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, who's become a well-known veteran Navy SEAL, and just a really good book on, leadership, which I think leadership in general is just an interesting theme, and feels like society needs, we need stronger leadership kind of all around, it feels like these days. So yeah, great book.
We will be sure to link both of these in the show notes for today's episode. So if you're curious to grab a copy, feel free. Links will be in the notes. Guys, it's been great to chat with you and hear the sort of windy, twisty history of Pastor Properties, and really exciting to see what you're up to today and what you're focusing on today and looking forward. There's only one more thing to do here, and that is to roll out the digital red carpet for you both. Tell the world what you're up to and where they could find out more online and maybe get in touch with you guys.
Yeah,
I
go
guess
ahead,
that's
Howard.
me. Well, thank you, Chris. It's been a blast. Um, what are we up to right now? I'd say, two projects I would bring to the world's attention. We have a redevelopment of some street front retail in St. Paul at Snelling and Selby, right across from Whole Foods, and looking for some interesting food and beverage and unique retailers in a great location. I'll let Mike talk about maybe our Mendota Plaza
Sure.
development. You can find us online at pastorprop.com. Our Instagram handle is Pastor Properties. It's Paster. And LinkedIn, just to make it even more confusing, is Pastor
Oh, wow.
Enterprises
Wow.
That's
slash
okay. We
Taking it
LLC.
have
back.
that's why we have the show notes. No
Yeah.
one, don't be alarmed, anyone. We have the links in the description
Yeah.
here, so we're all good. No worries.
Well, as Howard said, thanks, Chris. Really appreciate the opportunity. Always great to chat with you. Project we're working on, as Howard mentioned, we've got a strip center in Mendota Heights, and we're working on kind of a larger scale redevelopment of that shopping center. Somewhat similar to some of the things that we did at Texa Tonka that we'd like to bring to that neighborhood. So you can kind of, yeah, look out for us in that area. And then as Howard said, find us on social media, think we all aspire to be a little more active on social media, but you can certainly find us there and LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Well, guys, thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure. Howard and Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be with you.